All right, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is Rachel Gregory, your host, and I'm here today with Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Rachel, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited you're here. As I was saying off air, it's been a long time coming. I've been really excited to have you on. I really love and admire all the work that you're doing in this space, and I'm excited to dive into some questions that we have from listeners, some questions that I have for myself. And yeah, so before we get started, do you want to just tell our listeners or viewers, a little bit about your story, your background, kind of how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, you bet. Well, my name is Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and I practice a concept of medicine called muscle-centric medicine. And this really came about through my years and years of training. So I trained under Dr. Donald Layman. So I did my undergraduate degree in human nutrition, vitamin, mineral metabolism. And I was fortunate enough to work in the lab of Dr. Donald Layman at the University of Illinois. For those of you who don't know who he is one of the grandfathers, and I'm sure he would cringe hearing me say that, one of the grandfathers of protein metabolism. I started very, very early on in my career studying nutrition with a particular focus on protein. And of course, as I'm sure that we'll get into, the more you focus on protein, you have to acknowledge muscle, skeletal muscle health. So from that point on, that changed the trajectory of everything for me. I studied nutrition professionally for 7 years. I did a fellowship at WashU in St. Louis in obesity medicine, nutritional sciences, and geriatrics. So that's kind of how it came about.
Awesome, awesome. And I love this idea of muscle-centric medicine. Do you want to talk is that it's a newer concept that you've come up with, or?
It is. Like I said before, I had started out very early on in my career in nutritional sciences. That is what my undergraduate is in. It's in nutritional sciences, vitamin, mineral metabolism, and training under one of the world leading protein experts in a very carbohydrate heavy world. You can imagine that it was a different perspective. Rather than being fat centric, everybody at that time and still today is very fat centric, carbohydrate focused, fat phobic. But through Don's training and education, the emphasis was placed very much on skeletal muscle and protein metabolism. Mm-hmm. I took this through my medical training, medical school. I did 2 residencies. And throughout that time, it's interesting, as you're a student to medicine, you just see more and more obesity. And the conversations and the paradigm of thinking is very obese centric, as opposed to skeletal muscle or muscle centric, which is truly the organ of longevity. And again, actually responsible for all the metabolic outcomes, rather than focusing on the pathogenesis of obesity, which is really the primary target for many people. If people are very solution oriented, you have to bring into skeletal muscle. You have to bring that up in the conversation. And that's really where the focus began to change for me, as I realized there was a failure of the fat focused paradigm.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So why don't we just dive right into kind of my first question is really just for the listeners. What are the main benefits and what's the importance of having a good amount of skeletal muscle and building muscle specifically for women as well? Because we know that sometimes that can be looked down upon or whatever that may be. So yeah, the importance of building muscle for everybody.
Muscle is, again, well, first of all, muscle is not only the organ of longevity, it's the largest organ in the body, just by mass. Simply, muscle is an endocrine organ. When you contract it, it secretes compounds, which are called myokines. These go throughout the body. They're anti-inflammatory. They have impacts on the brain and the bone and, the entire immune system. So there's the concept of muscle as an immune modulator, as an endocrine organ. And in addition to that, when we think about metabolic health, you have to think about skeletal muscle first. Skeletal muscle is in part responsible for the majority of glucose disposal, which means simply that the amount of carbohydrates that you ingest, your skeletal muscle is the site of first disposal. And that is of paramount importance, especially when you think about the average carbohydrate consumption in the US is roughly 300 grams a day, even though the RDA may be 130. Mm-hmm. So we are more than double in our consumption of carbohydrates. This is a problem.
Yeah.
Glucose disposal is of primary importance. Fatty acid oxidation is also another important aspect of skeletal muscle. Amino acid reservoir. So if someone becomes injured or if they are on bed rest or can't train, we are in a certain situation right now where people may become sick. It's your skeletal muscle that then augments your survivability. Those are just a few things. We know that it's important as an endocrine organ. We also know that it's very vital as a metabolic organ. So now we have two things that skeletal muscle does, not to mention looking good in a bikini, right? Or mankini, whatever you want. And mobility, flexibility, mobility, strength. So activities of daily living. As you can see, the same cannot be said for adipose tissue. Skeletal muscle is really primary. And my message and work really focus on shifting the conversation from obesity, obesogenic, to muscle-centric.
Love it, love it. And so kind of along the lines with obviously the importance of muscle, and like you said, it's not just about how it makes us look, but there's so many different, so many aspects to it that are so important for overall health. When it comes to protein intake as well, can we talk about kind of like the main importance of protein and maybe the ideal amount that?
Absolutely. And I also want to mention something else is that when we age, it's interesting, around the time of menopause is when women lose the most skeletal muscle. And that is just a very interesting concept. And I've been talking about it for quite some time, is that there's kind of this inflection point that you have to train throughout your life to prevent a particular trajectory of aging, right? So you get into this moment where it's kind of like a switch, although, we know what I'm saying. It's not a switch, but there is this physiological change that happens, and you must account for that changing physiological milieu. And the way in which you account for this is through dietary protein and exercise. And you asked a great question about protein. Why protein? How much do we need? Well, protein is the feeder, the builder of skeletal muscle. And high quality animal-based proteins provide the correct amino acids to stimulate high quality protein and skeletal muscle within your body. What is high quality protein? I typically think about the branched chain amino acids, which are isoleucine and Beilein. When you think about that, you have to think about leucine as the stimulus for skeletal muscle. As it relates to protein intake, this is where the overall protein amount and particularly the dosing per meal becomes very relevant. What does that mean? Well, when you're young, you can get away with haphazard amount of protein. So you actually can get away with less protein per meal. So maybe if you want to get into specifics, you could get away with 20 grams of protein per meal and you'll still get a stimulus. But as you become more mature, and when I say more mature, 30s, 40s, which within your 30s isn't that old, right? We could all agree that that's not that old, but over a period of time, the efficiency of protein metabolism goes down. The way in which we can augment that is by having a 30 to 50 gram meal of protein to actually stimulate that skeletal muscle.
And would you say like per day, like what would be your average kind of intake per day that you recommend?
Per day, it would be 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. And that's high. Okay. Most people don't need that. You're never going to need that, but it's a safe bet. And if you do it based on that, then you're less likely to overconsume carbohydrates and fat. And there's a natural cutoff mechanism. There's a shutoff mechanism where you kind of go, I'm good. I don't want another chicken breast.
Yeah.
It's much less likely. You are much less likely to overeat protein than you are going to overeat almonds or chips.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And then in terms of kind of just talking about, you mentioned the quality of protein.
Yeah.
Can we chat a little bit about the difference between a few of the different types of protein? So, animal versus plant, and then maybe even getting a little bit more specific into some supplements, like, for example, whey versus collagen and the different kind of amino acid profiles within those that a lot of people don't think about.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't actually eat for protein, by the way. We actually eat for the amino acids. And when we think about the amino acids, you think about the branched chain amino acids. And the reason you care about the branched chains is you care about skeletal muscle. but you care about a lot of other things. So there are essential and non-essential amino acids. And really, we eat for that group of essential amino acids. And it's not important to decide what exactly those are, because that becomes just irrelevant in the way of thinking about how you're consuming food. What you do need to think about is high quality animal-based products. What does that mean? That means things like eggs, beef, bison, chicken, turkey. It doesn't mean getting your protein from quinoa or broccoli or beans. Those are all low quality proteins. When you look at the back of a bottle, let's say you pick up a bottle and it's a plant-based protein, it's roughly 50%, maybe a little bit higher, but a safe way to look at it is if a hemp protein shake has 30 grams of protein on the back, you can account for the fact that it's a low bioavailable protein. It roughly has 15 grams of protein, something like that. It really depends on if it's pea or what, whatever you're getting, but the bioavailability and the quality is different, which brings me to the concept of collagen. Collagen, I actually don't count as a protein source. Collagen peptides are largely devoid of branched chain amino acids, very low in branched chains, very low in tryptophan. I do suggest collagen use, but I suggest it as an augmentation to an already optimal protein diet.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think you explained it very well in terms of the differences. And it's really, like you said, it just comes down to that amino acid profile. Like you don't necessarily need to know all the amino acids and all that, but just being educated on like, okay.
You're not going to look at a food and go, well, I really wonder how much lysine is in that. Or is this a food that's high in methionine? I think that when you do that, you miss the big picture of what is a high quality protein and what is not. If you are protein forward and you anchor your plate in protein, you are going to have a better ability to satiate yourself. You're much less likely to binge eat. You're much less likely to overeat. You're much more likely to have a favorable metabolic effect. It's going to impact skeletal muscle. You're less likely to then overconsume carbohydrates or fats. There's a lot of reasons why you would want to utilize protein first.
For sure, for sure. And then in terms of, while we're on quality protein, just chat a little bit about kind of, your opinion on red meat versus maybe like chicken breast. Is there a difference?
Well, we know that just by looking at it, it looks different. So there's more iron in one than the other. But both are high quality protein sources. Red meat has a high bioavailable content of iron, zinc, selenium, B vitamins. It's the original superfood, which is such a dumb word, but it is.
No, yeah. And it makes sense too. Like you said, like just looking at, like, it's more colorful. It's more.
It's creatine. It has all these other things.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah.
But listen, chicken is great. And you don't have to have, we eat a lot of meat in our house and you don't have to necessarily eat that way. But certainly if you're thinking about optimizing for muscle, you want to eat high quality protein. Could you do it as a vegan or vegetarian? You could. Is it ideal? Probably not.
And just to mention too, I wanted to say this, but if anybody listening doesn't understand what bioavailability is, just means like how your body absorbs and actually uses the protein that you're consuming, right? Okay.
Right. And one of the issues with plant-based proteins is there's a fiber content, there's a food matrix, and that becomes very difficult to absorb. And also a lot of the nutrients are bound.
Gotcha. Yeah.
However, I am not shaming carbohydrates or vegetables. It doesn't matter to me, right? That's not the topic of conversation. The key point here is understanding the difference in bioavailability of protein. No matter what people say or how it is argued, these are hard, fast biological values that do not change.
Exactly, exactly. Awesome. Well, I have a few listener questions that I wanted to get to if you're down for that.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So, and these are questions that came from Instagram. So the first one is, and this kind of relates to the first topic you chatted about, is it possible to build muscle over the age of 50? If so, what should be the main factors to focus on?
Absolutely. Can you build muscle over the age of 50? There's a lot of things that come into play here. One of the original questions is, what is the training status of an individual? The more untrained an individual is, the easier it's going to be to lay down muscle, period. What that means is if someone has been a lifelong athlete and they're 50, then they will be able to put down muscle, but it'll probably be more challenging because there's this physiological phenomenon that happens called anabolic resistance. And that simply means that the efficiency of protein use goes down. The way in which you overcome that is that you do resistance training, and volume is very important. Going to failure and perceived exertion is also very important. Then immediately following, having a protein bolus is exponentially beneficial. And there's a ton of data out there that by combining resistance training, and it's not just the mechanical load that matters, it's also your increasing blood flow. You increase blood flow, you also increase nutrient absorption when you then introduce protein. So that is a strategy that I would implement. The other thing is making sure that your hormones are optimized. There's no direct correlation between optimal testosterone or estrogen levels and the amount of muscle that you could lay down, right? That would be irresponsible for me to say that. However, I will tell you from anecdotal experience and having been in practice for quite some time that when a person is optimized hormonally, they are much more likely to be able to recover, and they do seem to have an advantage when it comes to putting on skeletal muscle.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then I think a woman actually asked this question. So speaking to like women versus men, is there any difference there in terms of age and the ability to build muscle, or not really?
We don't know exactly in terms of, so men are going to be able to put on muscle, we think, more. They just are more anabolic in the way that they have higher testosterone. The amount of muscle an individual could put on we'd have no idea. There's so many factors that, is there a fiber type? Is there a training component, nutrition component? So there are multiple moving parts, as it relates to what we could say that is evidence-based. For women, it tends to be harder for them to put on muscle in general. And this in part could be just due overall to body size. It could also be to training status, their ability or their desire to train with the necessary intensity. I know you don't have that problem. I don't have that problem, at least when I'm not pregnant. And Ashley doesn't have that problem. We train with an intense nature. And so it does allow us to put on muscle, but you are not going to train and look like a dude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in terms of like putting on muscle over the age of 50, the main focuses would probably be obviously resistance training, getting enough protein. Is there anything else high on that list, or would those be
Sleep is important for rest and recovery. Making sure that you're not going through long periods of fasting. Fasting is catabolic. Being very strategic in your nutrition plan, having that first meal of the day when you're coming off of fasting, whenever that is, be optimized for protein. That becomes very important. Really hitting, it's interesting. I talk a lot about an even distribution. That's one strategy. An even distribution of protein intake is my baseline strategy for correcting metabolic dysfunction, for optimizing body composition. And when I say body composition, I should really highlight skeletal muscle. That's the secondary strategy then is making sure at least 2 meals a day are with a 40 to 50 gram amount of protein, high quality animal-based protein.
Got it.
They did that, maybe add in 5 grams of creatine and you would see a capacity for improvement.
Love it. And in terms of creatine, just while we're talking about that, can you chat a little bit about the benefits of supplementing with creatine?
Interesting. People that eat a lot of red meat don't necessarily need to eat or take in 5 grams of creatine. But the reason I like it is because the thing here is this person is over the age of 50. Mm-hmm. And the chances are there may be a decreased desire to want to eat the amount of protein necessary or red meat necessary. And this is just from years of experience. So by adding in 5 grams of creatine, we know that it helps muscle. We know that it helps brain and energy. Mm-hmm. There's no downside.
Yeah. And there's kind of a misconception, I feel like, that's out there, or a misunderstanding, I would say, in terms of taking creatine and gaining weight, right? Can you speak to that a little bit?
It's just, if an individual were to gain weight, it's only temporary. You always have to decide. In my practice, I use certain peptides and there's an initial weight gain. This isn't creatine, but this is a peptide, and they sleep better. The patients are stronger. They put on skeletal muscle. They lose body fat. There's all other reasons why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And then in terms of creatine specifically, would be more so due to like the water accumulation and holding on to that versus actually gaining fat from taking creatine. It's not really how it works.
You're not going to gain fat unless you're overeating.
Exactly.
or whatever the efficiency is that you're utilizing calories.
Yeah. Awesome. So moral of the story is you can absolutely build muscle over 50. You just want to make
Of
sure you're
course.
prioritizing those things that you chat about.
Yeah.
Sweet. Okay. So the next question, this kind of goes to what we were talking about too with leucine. So someone asked, can you discuss the research on higher protein, specifically leucine, when breaking a fast?
No one should take leucine alone. The way in which the amino acids work, it's leucine, isoleucine, and Beilein in a 2 to 1 to 1 ratio. And the way that is just as it relates to cellular metabolism. If you decide to supplement with one, you push all of the other ones into a cycle, right? It's not advisable. I never recommend supplementing with an amino acid on its own as it relates to a branched chain amino acid simply because of their cellular metabolism.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
So if you were to supplement with like BCAAs specifically, you'd want them all in the same ratio, right? Okay. Or in their ratios that they're supposed to.
Ratio, yeah.
Gotcha. And then in terms of the second half of this question was specifically research on higher protein, but when you're breaking a fast. Is there anything?
I'm not sure what the question is exactly, but the reason I would think about protein as a meal specific, ingestion.
Mm-hmm.
If you are thinking about breaking a fast, higher protein would be most beneficial because the muscle is now primed. You are coming back out of a catabolic state, a quote fasting state. This is the time where you want to optimally stimulate skeletal muscle. And the way you do that is you got to get your protein number right.
Mm-hmm. And then
that's where leucine comes in. So this is where optimizing for leucine, the reason you want to optimize for leucine is because you want to optimize for mTOR, which is mechanistic target of rapamycin.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask. So what is that so why is leucine so important? I kind of explain it as like kind of like that light switch that's like what turns on muscle protein synthesis, but maybe you can explain it a little bit better.
It does turn on muscle protein synthesis, but you need all the amino acids. Mm-hmm. So you couldn't just give someone leucine and then say, well, I've given you leucine, muscle protein synthesis is now initiated. You are still not going to lay down skeletal muscle. It's like turning on a car with no gas in it. Mm-hmm. You provide leucine, but you have to provide all the amino acids to lay down tissue.
Interesting.
Leucine is the trigger, is the key in the engine, but all the rest of the amino acids are essential. You need them.
I love that analogy. Yeah. So leucine is the key in the engine, and then everything else is the gas. So if you have no gas, then...
So it would be worthless to take branched chain amino acids by themselves.
Gotcha.
Unless you are trying to, as it relates to laying down skeletal muscle, or as it relates to repair. Could it prevent a catabolic state or some kind of catabolism? Depends. Yes, it can. Perhaps, the data is questionable in immobilization. If someone's in a cast, is it going to prevent it? Just reading a paper now, it actually shows that exercise is much more important.
Interesting. So would you ever recommend taking like a BCAA supplement, or like sipping on one during a workout?
If you want to lower your caloric intake, branched chain amino acids are great, especially with a lower protein meal. Anecdotally, I have found that it makes people less sore if they take it right after a workout with some fluids. Could it be the fluids? Could it be the branched chain amino acids? Yeah. But those are the ways that I would use it. I wouldn't use it alone to say, well, I'm going to take these branched chains and I'm going to lay down skeletal muscle. That would not be a correct use of branched chain amino acids. But I actually love branched chain amino acids. And again, the way in which you use them is if you're using collagen, keep in mind there's no tryptophan in them, but the branched chain amino acids, if you're having a plant-based protein, the way in which you would augment that would be utilizing branched chains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's how I recommend it if I'm working with, I don't work with many vegetarian vegan clients, but I have with a few in the past, and supplementing with those BCAAs on top of whatever their plant protein is tends to be a good idea just to make sure they're getting all of that. Awesome. Okay. So the next question, does it matter when we eat foods, breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Sorry, this is a two-part question. Does it matter when we eat foods? And then are there good and bad foods to eat together?
Does it matter when you eat foods? I think that everything matters. When you are thinking about, I'm going to give you an example. Are you ready? When I worked in the hospital, I did night shifts. And it was so interesting because when you did night float, that means you slept during the day and you were up starting at 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. You could eat the same kind of food in the day and switch it to nights and switch your circadian rhythm, and you'd put on weight. Perhaps you shouldn't be up all night eating because there are changes in insulin sensitivity and glucose as it relates to changing your circadian rhythm. So that's one extreme. The other concept of does it matter when you eat? I think consistency and training your body is very important. Food is a circadian anchor. It's not just light. By keeping it consistent, putting it in a time restricted window, I found to eat best I found it to work best that way when it comes to hunger management, also weight.
Interesting. So would you recommend, in terms of like a time restricted window, what do you typically recommend? And
8 to 9 hour feeding window.
Okay.
I have found that work the best for patients. Yeah.
Okay. So do you usually push like to start eating later in the day, start eating earlier in the day?
Depends on the person. If an individual wakes up starving, there's that bio individuality that's important. For me, when I'm obviously not pregnant, I'll push it. I'll start eating at noon and finish at 8 or 7. Gotcha. So it all just depends.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. And then the second part was, are there, in quotation marks, good or bad foods to eat together? And I think they mean by in terms of like macronutrient distribution.
I think when you are thinking about macronutrients, you have to prioritize protein. You establish your protein need, then you can decide if you want to have carbohydrates or fats. When it comes to carbohydrates, there is a meal threshold amount, just like protein. And what's so interesting is, can you overeat protein? Not really, but perhaps you won't have any more benefit from eating more than 60 grams per meal. Whereas carbohydrates, if you overeat carbohydrates and really over 40 grams, depending on if you are exercising or not, you get a higher insulin response. And insulin is a problem. Despite what people say, excess insulin, more robust insulin response is not ideal, because then you can get a subsequent drop in blood sugar.
Gotcha. Okay. So in terms of, like if we're talking about maybe kind of giving an example between someone who is more sedentary versus someone who, works out an hour and a half a day in terms of their carbohydrate intake, maybe we get, and insulin, can we chat a little bit about that?
Sure, certainly. So the way in which you get your carbs is you earn them, and you earn them through activity. So you could earn anywhere from 30 to 70 grams, depending on how it, per hour, depending on how intense you're training. Whereas someone who's sedentary, you don't actually need carbohydrates. Your body can generate everything it needs when you're eating enough protein.
Yeah, for sure.
There's no essential carbohydrate need. The body can generate it with protein requirements met.
And then in terms of like fat intake, how would you recommend in terms of like macronutrient distribution? Is there anything specific that you recommend with that?
I typically don't recommend it around training, pre and post training. I think that, but again, it all depends. I've had endurance runners and, endurance athletes that are going to run 100 miles. They eat a lot of fat before and after. But I would say for the typical athlete or athletic person, I wouldn't put fat before or after, really. But I'm equal opportunity. You prioritize protein, and then you decide how you're going to use your calories, whether it's carbohydrates or fats.
Yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. Okay, so this question, we have a few more questions. Someone said, what is the safety of low carb or keto diets in pregnancy and the effect of OGTT at 28 weeks? Specific question.
Well, I think that the question really is, can you eat keto during your pregnancy? And I don't see why not. I tend to be pretty nauseous during pregnancy. So if you can eat that way, great. There's no issue. In terms of the oral glucose tolerance test, that is going to depend on your own ability to handle glucose.
And are there any recommendations for someone who might be, maybe they are following a lower carb keto lifestyle going into pregnancy, and they know they're going in to take this test, and
then they probably won't fail it. It's really a test for gestational diabetes. Chances are if you are training and you're eating low carb, you're not going to fail it. But again, there's a genetic component to that. As it relates to fertility and pregnancy, I don't promote a ketogenic diet. I think that there's a time and a place for it, but I personally don't actually really use it in my practice unless unless someone has a brain injury. It's not my primary go-to.
I see. And what would be kind of like your general, and this is obviously very individualized to the person, but in terms of just kind of what you see as, and I guess this is kind of a bad question, but like optimal kind of diet or lifestyle in the sense of, protein first, and then just kind of like you said.
Nutrient density. The next thing that you have to really think about is nutrient density. Eggs have choline in it. They're great for the brain. They're great for the baby's brain. You think about lutein. Think about lutein with eggs, kale, dark kale, avocado, things of that nature. Protein, macronutrient first, micronutrients second. Nutrient quality second.
Love it. Okay, cool. All right, next question. We're just rolling right through these. Okay, someone asked a personal question. What's a typical day of eating look like for you and training?
Eating and training. I will wake up in the morning, I have breakfast with my daughter. Well, she puts it on the floor and I have some of it, not off the floor in that order. We typically have eggs for breakfast. This morning I had eggs and goat cheese. I'll eat a little something and then I'll do some kettlebells. Right now I'm in my third trimester. I do kettlebells 3 days a week. At lunch, I hit the Airdyne for a couple rounds of interval training. I'll do some kettlebell. I'll do some Turkish get-ups. I'll do some kettlebell swings today, and I'll do some push presses. And I'll call it a day, and then I'll train tomorrow with my trainer, Melissa Paris, and we'll do more kettlebells. Kettlebells while you're pregnant, they're really easy. It's fun. It's functional. That's what my training looks like. So it's 3 days, no excuses, no matter how sick. Training. And then as it relates to cardio, I tend to lift weights faster, or I'll do Airdyne, but I don't really do a ton of slow, steady state. I might walk on the assault runner while I'm talking on the phone. For nutrition, if I'm not pregnant, it's very high protein and very little carbs. I would say it's more carnivore-esque. If, during pregnancy, I'm much more liberal. I'll have coconut yogurt. I do tend to watch my carbohydrate intake, but I'm not a carbivore by any means. I do have berries and I'll eat fruit and avocado fats and I try to mix it up. I try to even throw in some organ meats.
Awesome. And is that just in terms of during pregnancy, is there specifics to the nutrients that you're consuming, or is it just preference, cravings?
Eggs are really good for the baby's brain. The liver and the higher nutrient dense foods are also, again, vitamin A, D, fat soluble vitamins, really important right now. And then B vitamins and high quality protein, iron, zinc, selenium, those kinds of things. Very important. I try not to, I did get some gluten-free party mix that someone sent me. I did eat that. I'm still eating it. Thank you, Diana. But other than that, my nutrition is pretty good, pretty tight. The other thing is we're an example for the people around us.
Yeah, for sure. Especially during, the times that we're in.
Yeah.
Have you seen this kind of just diving into this subject, but in terms of like the last year and, facing quarantine and the pandemic, is there anything that you've noticed with your patients or anything that you've had to focus on more?
I wouldn't say more. I think initially getting them, making sure they're training, and with the gym shut down, is finding ways to train. But my patients are highly, highly motivated. Maybe some of them were a little more depressed, but not really. My patient group they're tough, they're motivated, they're mavericks,
Love it. Awesome. Okay. So the last question from the listener, and then I have one final question. Someone asked, what, if any, supplements would you recommend to include in your kind of everyday?
I love a fish oil. I love creatine. I love a probiotic, depending what they need, a vitamin D for sure. Vitamin D, K2, vitamin C, glutathione. Those are all kind of core for me.
Okay.
And a great multivitamin.
Love it. And then in terms of just going back to fish oil, because I feel like there's a lot of confusion out there in terms of, the quality of fish
Yeah.
oil and even multivitamins, things like that. Can you speak to a little bit of that?
Yeah, you have to go with a brand you trust. I use First Form. I work with them. They're amazing. And you just have to really think about what is a high quality product. And that really comes down to reputation. You can go down. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't really have a ton of extra time on my hands. So I leave it to the experts. You find people you trust, you see what they're recommending, and then you go for those recommendations because that's their wheelhouse.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Yeah,
all
I
kinds
agree.
of certifications. There's all kinds of things that you can look into about the supplements that you're taking. But my recommendation is outsource the things that you can outsource, find the expert, get the recommendation, execute.
Yeah, for sure. I agree completely. Awesome. All right. I think we covered a lot.
Great.
So my final question for you is, and I always ask this, is there anything that you've personally changed your mind about in the last year and why? And it doesn't have to be nutrition or fitness. It can be anything at all.
Um, well, I'll give you a nutrition component and then I'll give you a personal component. Nutrition component is, again, I always talk about an even distribution of protein. That's not necessary. There's ways in which you can do it differently. There's ways in which you can protein pulse, and I'll talk more about that at the next interview, and we can talk about that. That's interesting. So I went from even distribution for metabolic parameters to something else for muscle parameters in terms of the amount per meal. The second thing is I have always had a brick and mortar practice, and I closed that this last year. And I have found that you can still offer the same quality of care, which was surprising, by doing everything telehealth. And that's incredible.
Yeah, that is super cool. I mean, I think that's something that a lot of us have learned in the last year is like how
Yeah, it's
like
amazing.
crazy, technology can be. And then just in terms, can we just quickly real last chat about, so the protein pulse, I know you mentioned, we chatted about this in the beginning in terms of like that 30 to 50, but is that what you're referring to in terms of that pulse?
Well, it doesn't have to be even distribution.
Okay.
When you think about protein pulsing, it's pulsing the amount throughout the day, but doing it correctly. You start with a large meal, you can end with a large meal, but you don't necessarily need the meal in between to be 30 grams or more because the data would suggest that perhaps mTOR is already stimulated.
Okay.
An individual can then decide how they're going to do the rest. This is all
Interesting.
coming out in my book.
Oh, tell us
Yeah.
about your book.
Well, it still has time, so I don't want to give away too much as it relates to time frame, but
Okay.
be out in 2022.
2022. Awesome. Okay. Well, I'll definitely, and that's what I was just going to ask you, where anybody listening, where can they find you, your website, social media?
Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, you can find me on Instagram. There's a ton of education. I write all my own content. I have a newsletter which goes out usually weekly, and it's high value information, really curated articles, things that I find important, and I'm not going to spam you. I have a whole other email that goes out once a month for picks on products. I really try to be respectful. The other thing is I have a YouTube, and it is all education, and it is really, really interesting stuff that you're not going to find anywhere else, because a large part of it up until this point is conversations with my mentor, Dr. Donna Layman, who is a lifelong academic. For those of you who know, it's very difficult for the academic community to translate information into the science to make it usable and interesting. Donna and I have conversations to do exactly that for you guys. And it takes a lot of time, but it's super high value. And
Awesome.
they can sign
Awesome.
up for my protocol and all the other stuff on my website. If you guys want to be a patient, I think I'm still taking new patients.
Awesome. Well, I will link that and all of those in the show notes. And
Great.
I personally am on your newsletter. I love it. So I'll link that and I'll link the YouTube channel
Great.
and your website.
Great. And then
Awesome.
you guys can find me on the normal social media. Twitter, I'm not super active, but for sure Instagram.
Sweet. Awesome. Well, this is great. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
taking the time. I'm really excited that I was able to get you on and chat about muscle and protein, all that jazz. And I'm excited for your book come out in 2022, you said?
Yep.
Sweet. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. I will talk to you
Okay.
soon.
Bye.